Good morning, friends. Uh, I've been asked by Umesh ji to talk about how is history done. And before I begin, I must say that I'm very grateful to Umesh ji and to the Department of History at Ramanujan College for inviting me to give this lecture. How is history done? Why did I choose to speak on this? The main reason is that in 2012, I was appointed as a professor of history and history education at Azim Premji University in Bengaluru. And there, in that university, I was to teach students of education, people who were doing an MA in education. And the subject that I was to teach them is called History and Social Science Education. So my work was to try and explain in that course how to teach history, how to teach political science, sociology, political economy, geography, and the like. And at the same time, how to develop materials, textbooks, for example, and other educational media in these subjects. So this was the nature of the course. And the course was attended by students who were pursuing an MA in education, but they actually came from many different backgrounds. Some of them were dentists, for example. Imagine somebody doing a bachelor's degree in dentistry and then coming to Azim Premji University to study education at the MA level. Some were medical doctors, some were engineers, scientists, geographers, students of literature, of political science, history, biology. So it was a mix. And many of them had therefore never studied history in higher education before. At a college, they had never studied history before. And my purpose was to teach them how to teach history in school. Okay? And I may add here that several years ago, Professor Indu Banga of Punjab University invited Professor Krishna Kumar and me to talk to the lecturers of history, lecturers in history at Punjab University about how to teach history. So, although I was teaching students in Azim Premji University about how to teach history in school, right, as a part of school education, I think it is a pertinent topic even for lecturers in colleges. Because sometimes lecturers and professors in colleges and universities, they tend to overlook pedagogy. They don't give that much weight to how they are to teach. They think that if they know the content, they'll be able to teach very easily. So I think because at Azim Premji University, there were people of different backgrounds, I felt that I should develop a model about how is history done. That is, what do I mean by done here? By done, I mean, how is it taught? How is it learnt? How is it written? How are textbooks prepared in it? How is it researched? So on and so forth. Okay. So I said I must tell them about how is history done in a simple way, but not in a simplistic manner. Something that explains the whole complexity of the process. You know, how should history be taught? Obviously, it should be taught in consonance with the way in which it is created. Therefore, whenever you are teaching history, you ought to also understand the nature of history. So, before teaching history, you ought to know what is history and how is history written, how is history constructed. Okay. So I said, if I have to tell them about how is history done, I must try and do it in a simple way without sounding simplistic, capturing all the complexities of the phenomenon under discussion. So I felt that the best way to do this would be to develop a model about how is history done. What are the key elements in doing history? That is, in researching it, in writing a new history, in reading about it, in teaching it, in learning it. Okay, what are the key elements in the construction and in the doing of history? And if I were to develop a model, then you know very well that a model is an intellectual template that simplifies reality in order to emphasize the recurrent, the general, and the typical. What are the typical features of doing any history? What are the recurrent features? This must be captured. And if I have to create a model should be such that it is generally applicable. Hence, what I will share with you now will apply to the creation and teaching of any history, whatever its time period, whatever its locale or theme. It could be the history of cricket in recent times. It could be the history of hunter-gathering groups in ancient times. It could be the history of the medieval state in medieval India. So any kind of history, my model must apply to any kind of history. And I would say to you that in this model, there are 6 basic elements, okay? And the first one of these is what I call problem for analysis. Can I please share the screen? Yes, I can do that. So whiteboard and text. Right. So this is the first element in my model. Problem for analysis or problems for analysis. So the question really is, first of all, when we are asking people, telling people, how is history written? How is it constructed? I'm told that Shishir has just finished a PhD. So how did he do his PhD? What did he do, right? How did that PhD come to be in the form of a manuscript or a typescript, which will be soon published, right? I'm sure that the first thing that he did and the first thing that his supervisors told him was, what is the problem that you're analyzing? What is your research problem? Now, when you are teaching, they may not have a research problem, but you'll at least have a problem for analysis, right? You'll be analyzing some problem or the other. Excuse me, I think he'll have to edit all this out. So, Shishir, what was your problem for analysis in your PhD? Shishir, can you hear me? You're on mute.
इनका unmute हो रखा है.
Yes,
You have to unmute yourself. What
Okay.
was your problem for analysis? आपने
Yes, sir.
किस मुद्दे को analyze किया?
Yes, sir. I had analysis about the religion in making of a region, the regional, and the second problem, the identity formation.
So,
Okay.
इसको थोड़ा और
religion,
तोड़ के
how
बताइए।
religion in a कि religion किस तरह से एक region को बनाता है. Okay, first.
Religion
दूसरा
किस तरह
problem
से एक
मैंने देखा
region को
कि
बनाता है. Okay. Religion किस तरह
religion
से,
in making of.
Okay. कोई भी
मैंने religion का क्या influence रहता है society, economy and polity में.
समझ गया
Okay.
समझ गया जी.
कि एक जी सेकेंड पॉइंट हाउ इट फॉर्म, हाउ आई थिंक कि किस तरह से एक आइडेंटिटी फॉर्म किया. Okay. And the second, another the points which I have discussed about the how at that time the rulers patronizes the religion.
जी जी. तो
Okay.
आप ये कह रहे हैं
And
कि अगर मैं आपकी बात ठीक समझाऊं तो आप ये कह रहे हैं कि धार्मिक गतिविधियां किसी भी क्षेत्र की पहचान, उसके स्वरूप को कैसे बनाती हैं, उस पे क्या असर डालती हैं,
जी,
है ना?
जी सर.
और साथ ही लोगों की अस्मिताएं इससे क्या बनती हैं,
जी,
उनकी शिनाख्त किस किस्म की बनती है, और राजा महाराजा और शासक किस किस प्रकार का आश्रय देते हैं या नहीं देते हैं किसी भी धार्मिक गतिविधि को या धार्मिक आंदोलन को या धार्मिक किसी भी धर्म की संस्था को.
और था कि विमेन्स रोल,
राइट.
कि विमेन का क्या पार्टिसिपेशन रहा, पीपल्स परसेप्शन विमेन के प्रति क्या थे और विमेन का पीपल मैन के प्रति क्या थे,
जी
कि
जी
ये दोनों का किस तरह से एक दूसरे के प्रति जो आपस में कोरिलेशन था, म्यूचुअल अंडरस्टैंडिंग था या नहीं.
जी.
ओके. तो ये सारे पॉइंट्स, और एक तो पॉलिटिकल कंटेक्चुअलाइज, दूसरा विमेन कंसेप्शन था सर, विमेन का परसेप्शन. ओके. एंड हाउ विमेन कुड बी सीन इन द रेलम ऑफ रिलीजन.
राइट राइट. आई
ओके.
अंडरस्टैंड.
तो ये सारे पॉइंट्स मैंने उनमें जो है सो हाईलाइट किया था सर.
जी जी. So,
Yes.
as you can see, Shishir, in doing his PhD, he began with a certain problem for analysis. And when we are teaching, when we are doing history in any form, be it teaching or researching or writing or reading about it, we must have a problem in mind. So, just to clearly explain this to you, let me give you a few examples of problems for analysis. You must appreciate that identifying or formulating interesting problems for analysis will immediately bring to our work both clarity and sophistication. देखिए, सबसे पहले ये पता होना चाहिए कि हम किस मुद्दे को देख रहे हैं, मुद्दा क्या है, किस मुद्दे का विश्लेषण कर रहे हैं. Okay? And if the chosen problem is weighty enough, it will inspire us to discover or create a rich explanation for that given phenomenon. Explanation that seeks to grasp the interplay of many different variables. So let me give you some examples of the sorts of interesting problems for analysis from our country's history. Now, all of you know, those who are students of modern India, they know that the anti-colonial national movement became an all-India mass movement for the first time from 1919-1920 onwards. Is this correct? जो हमारा राष्ट्रीय आंदोलन है, वो एक ऑल इंडिया मास मूवमेंट पहली बार 1919-20 में बनता है. Before this, it was not an all-India mass movement. This happens for the first time from 1919 onwards. Now, the problem for analysis is why? Why does it happen from this time only? Why did it not become a huge movement that was conducted in both city and village at an earlier date? Or why is it that this movement does not become a mass movement for the first time in 1930, later? What is special about 1919, 1920 that this becomes a mass movement? So here we are talking of a certain conjuncture of time. एक खास टाइम पीरियड की बात कर रहे हैं. कुछ बहुत सी चीजें होने लग गई हैं उस वक्त पे, जिसकी वजह से ये एक ऑल इंडिया मास मूवमेंट बनता है. उन बहुत से फैक्टर्स का इंटरप्ले क्या है, हमें ये देखना है. तो this, I think, is an interesting problem. And it also raises a more generic problem, namely, why do things happen when they happen? हिस्ट्री में अक्सर हम why और when को इकट्ठे जोड़ के देखते हैं. Why do things happen when they happen, right? तो 1919 से ही ये मास मूवमेंट क्यों बनती है? आई एम श्योर ऑल ऑफ यू विल अग्री विद मी that this is an interesting problem. Let me share a second problem with you, this time from medieval history. And the problem is, in fact, it is a problem that can cover both medieval as well as modern history. The problem really is, how and when did Sikhism crystallize into a separate faith? When did Sikhism become a religion in its own right? If you look at the Minorities Commission today, they will list Sikhism as a separate religion. Okay? Now, Nanak was not a Keshdhari Sikh. Nanak was born into a Hindu family, into a Khatri family in 15th century Punjab. And when Nanak started to discover the mysteries of religion, when he started out on his spiritual quest, he did not immediately become a Sikh. Okay? Maybe he was a Nirguna Bhakta. And how did this Nirguna Bhakta become a Sikh, or how did he start something called Sikhism? And when did what he started become Sikhism, a separate religion from Hinduism? Did it happen in the 15th century itself? Or did it happen when the Adi Granth or the Granth Sahib was compiled in the time of the 5th Guru? Or did it happen in the time of the 10th Guru, when the Keshdhari identity was started by Guru Gobind Singh in 1699? Or did it happen even later in the 19th century, when the Singh Sabhas were established in the Punjab? And even later, until 1905, can you imagine, until 1905, 1905 तक जो हरमंदिर साहिब है, हरमंदिर साहिब अमृतसर में सरोवर के आसपास चारों तरफ हिंदू देवी देवताओं के मंदिर थे, छोटे छोटे. ओके, देवस्थान थे, कोई कृष्ण का, कोई राम का, कोई देवी का. और ये जो देवस्थान थे सरोवर के इर्द गिर्द, ये पहली बार वहां से 1905 में हटे. अगर आप जाएंगे आज हरमंदिर साहिब अमृतसर, तो आप कोई हिंदू मंदिर उस बिल्डिंग के अंदर नहीं पाएंगे. बट until 1905, there were shrines dedicated to different gods and goddesses of the Hindu pantheon, and these were removed from there in 1905. So can we say that Sikhism became a separate religion at that time? Or did it become a separate religion after 1921, when the corrupt mahants were removed from the gurdwaras by the British, because Gandhi and the non-cooperation movement put pressure on the colonial authorities to do so. And the gurdwaras came into the hands of something called the Sikh Gurdwara Prabandhak Committee, that is the SGPC, right? So did Sikhism become a separate religion after 1921? Now look, it's very interesting, right? It's very, very interesting. And equally interesting, linked to this big problem, is another problem. That why is it that all the Sikh gurus are shown with kesh, right? Whereas we don't know, before the time of Guru Gobind Singh, before the time of 1699, whether they wore any kesh or not, and if they wore, how did they wear them? We have no idea, because this injunction that all Sikhs should wear uncut hair, वो बालों को काटे ना और इसलिए वो लंबे बाल रखते हैं, ये जो हुक्म है, ये तो 1699 में गुरु गोविंद सिंह ने दिया. उससे पहले के गुरु भी जब हम पिक्चर्स देखते हैं तो उनको केशधारी दिखाया जाता है. तो क्या वो वाकई पहले के गुरु केशधारी थे? और अगर नहीं थे तो उनको केशधारी क्यों दिखाया जा रहा है? ये एक tradition को invent किया जा रहा है. This is really what Hobsbawm and Ranger call and the invention of tradition, right? They haven't worked on Sikhism, they worked in Europe. But this is the sort of phenomenon that is sometimes referred to as the invention of tradition. Third question, third problem for analysis. We all know that Buddhism was born in India, correct? The Buddha lived in the foothills of the Himalayas in Nepal and Bihar, and Buddhism was born in India. And yet today we have very few Buddhists in India. So Buddhism had a meteoric rise and a meteoric decline in India. 6th century BC के बाद जल्दी फैलता है और फिर जल्दी उसका पतन होता है. तो इतनी तेजी से क्यों फैलता है पहले और फिर इतनी तेजी से उसका पतन क्यों होता है? Why does it have a swift rise and a swift decline in India? Very interesting problem for analysis. And maybe one day I will talk to Shishirji about, he's an ancientist, about this question. Why does Buddhism decline in India? Whereas, it flourishes in other parts of the world, especially in Southeast Asia and East Asia, right? In places like Sri Lanka, etc. So interesting question for analysis. I'll share with you two more questions, just to tell you how the learning and teaching of history and the construction of history both can become fascinating if we are to base them on very specific, weighty, insightful problems for analysis. If we are to base them on asking the right kind of questions, okay? Now this example, the fourth example, it comes from educational history. So some of you might know that there was something called the National Education Commission of 1964-66. Okay, this also goes by the name of Kothari Commission. And this commission recommended that a common public education system be introduced in the country. What is meant by common school system in the country? They meant that these schools should be run by the government, that children should go only to a neighborhood school so that they can walk to school and walk back home, and that these schools should have excellent standards. And everybody should go to these government schools. If at all there are to be private schools, there should be very few. And as in the US, only the very rich attend private schools. Extremely rich people, their children go to private schools. Middle class people in the US do not attend private schools. Okay? Most people in the United States go to Sarkari schools. And the Sarkari schools are very good. Okay? So the Sarkar should create schools in such a way that children go to Sarkari schools in the neighborhood, and that these Sarkari schools should have a very high standard. As good a standard as the best private schools, right? And this will create a common school system for all, for the rich and the poor, for people of all castes, for people of all classes, for people of all kinds of backgrounds. The National Education Commission of 1964-66 recommended this. And this is the period when Nehru died. So it comes towards the end of the Nehru period. Nehru died, as you know, in 1964. And there was still a lot of euphoria about building the country, building its institutions. We had begun to build the IITs, the NCERT, AIMS. We had built the steel plants. We had already built the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, built by Tata. We were going into space research. Many new institutions were being built. We had built Pokhrama. So why is it that a common school system could not really take off in India despite the recommendations of a high-powered government commission? Very interesting question. ये क्यों नहीं हुआ? We don't have excellent government schools where all go, right? Why did it not happen? Finally, I'll say one last example. This is a very large question. Last example is a very large question, which in fact will have to be broken into several specific questions. So how did social class, caste, religious identity, and patriarchy interpenetrate in different time periods and locations to produce groups suffering from what has been called compounded disadvantage? Yeah. So the question is that if in Indian history there are groups that are disadvantaged, जो पीछे रह गए हैं, जिनको हम कभी ओबीसी कहते हैं, कभी एससी कहते हैं, कभी एसटी कहते हैं, कभी दलित कहते हैं, कभी हरिजन कहते हैं, वगैरह वगैरह, लेकिन जो सही शब्द है about most oppressed caste groups is Dalit, right? तो जो लोग पीछे रह गए हैं, कई बार तो वो लगता है कि कास्ट की वजह से, जाति की वजह से पीछे है. कई बार ऐसे लगता है कि एक कंपाउंड है, जाति की वजह से भी पीछे हैं, लेकिन गरीबी की वजह से भी पीछे हैं. So class and caste interpenetrate. Sometimes religious community, caste and class interpenetrate to produce backwardness. For example, the Muslim community is disadvantaged in many respects. I won't go into that, but if you look at the Sachar committee report, you'll be able to understand how the Muslim community is disadvantaged on account of being Muslim. Okay. Then, owing to gender, there may be a certain series of disadvantages that happen. So, because of the disadvantage of gender, you get what is called patriarchy. So, how do the class, caste, religious community, and structures of gender interpenetrate to create compounded disadvantage? A very interesting question. At different time periods in different places in our history. And if you are to do this, then of course you'll have to break this up into further questions, into many sub-questions. Only then will you be able to answer this, with the focus being on some specific region. So to go back to Shishir's example, Shishir's PhD, your PhD must be on some region, right? And on some time period. What is the region and time period?
Yes, 6th to 13th century AD, sir.
And कौन सा इलाका है ये?
ये इलाका particularly in Bihar region, sir.
बिहार.
Yes.
तो ये बिहार की बात कर रहे हैं. देखिए 6 to 13 सेंचुरीज में कर रहे हैं. अब इसमें देखना पड़ेगा, जैसे कि इन्होंने बात की अपनी पीएचडी की, कि जो धार्मिक गतिविधियां हैं वो इस क्षेत्र को क्या पहचान देती हैं. लेकिन अगर हम इस सवाल को बदल दें और देखें कि भाई इस पीरियड में जो डिसएडवांटेज ग्रुप्स थे, उनका एलिमेंट ऑफ डिसएडवांटेज क्लास, कास्ट, रिलीजन और पेट्रियार्की से कैसे बन रहा है, तो वो सवाल हो जाएगा जो मैंने उठाया है. ओके, सो दीज आर इंटरेस्टिंग क्वेश्चंस. सो माय फर्स्ट क्वेश्चन इज, how is history done? The first element in doing history, in teaching it, in constructing it, and writing it, is to raise a significant problem for analysis. Now, when you raise a problem for analysis, after that, you will obviously have to answer that problem. You'll have to respond to that problem. You'll have to come up with an answer to the problem. And that can be done. When you do that, you will obviously then come up with some kind of an explanation, right? So if this is the first thing, problem for analysis, then number 2 will be explanation. Okay, and explanations always, you look at any explanation, right, of a problem for analysis, you will see that it takes the form of argument plus narrative, plus narrative. Okay, there'll be an argument and there'll be a narrative. Now the point is that what is this explanation which consists of argument and narrative? What are these arguments and narratives built on? How are they created? First, I'd just like to say that sometimes people think that telling a story or giving a narrative is not so significant in history, that narrating or describing is less important than analyzing. Some people may feel that. Therefore, they may feel it is less important than arguing, than giving arguments. But the fact of the matter is that the two go hand in hand. You can't argue without describing. You can't argue without telling a story. The real thing that lots of historians do is that they fold narrative into argument. The two come together. They are imbricated. जैसे ये मेरा हाथ, उंगलियां जो हैं एक दूसरे के अंदर गुथी हुई हैं, ऐसे ही कहानी और तर्क एक दूसरे के अंदर गुथे होते हैं. इम्ब्रिकेशन होता है दोनों का. पर ये जो इम्ब्रिकेशन है नैरेटिव का और आर्गुमेंटेशन का, मेरे पास वक्त कम रह गया है तो मैं डिटेल में नहीं जाऊंगा, लेकिन अगर आपने देखना है कि नैरेटिव पे और आर्गुमेंटेशन पे लोगों ने क्या लिखा है, तो मैं आपको याद दिलाता हूं ऐसे ही इन पासिंग कि लॉरेंस स्टोन ने द रिटर्न ऑफ द नैरेटिव की बात की लेट 20th सेंचुरी में, कि हिस्ट्री सिर्फ आर्गुमेंट से नहीं चल सकता है, उसमें नैरेटिव भी होना चाहिए. ओके, लेकिन ये आर्गुमेंट और नैरेटिव ये कहां से निकलते हैं, इनका आधार क्या है? अब जो भी दलील, या अगर मैं प्लूरल यूज करूं उर्दू का, दलाइल जो इस्तेमाल की शिशिर ने, जो तर्क इस्तेमाल किए होंगे शिशिर जी ने अपने थीसिस में, उनका आधार क्या है ना? तो उनका आधार आपके हिसाब से क्या बनता है? कैन एनीवन टेल मी दिस?
The sources he using.
Sources, okay.
Primary sources.
Okay. तो sources से क्या निकलता है?
Sources से interpretations, the question he has raised.
The question he has raised, उसका जवाब निकलेगा, लेकिन जवाब तो आप बनाएंगे ना, आपके दिमाग से जवाब बनेगा ना. लेकिन जो कच्चा माल है वो क्या है? In a sense. तो बिल्कुल ठीक कह रहे हैं कि सोर्सेज हैं, बिल्कुल सही बात है वो.
You have right.
हाँ जी 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 बोलिए. तो देखिए, नंबर 2 इज बेस्ड ऑन.
ये बातें बिल्कुल सही कहा सर कि जो प्राइमरी सोर्सेज जो हैं सर, उन सोर्सेज में रियली बहुत सारे स्टोरीज हैं. जिस स्टोरीज को I think the crux from the narrative, the stories.
इन सोर्सेज में क्या है सर?
Because I think in the primary sources, where in the primary source we get several references, okay, in the context of time and space.
हाँ, references मिलते हैं. हाँ जी जी.
हाँ सर, मेरी आवाज आ रही है सर?
जी आ रही है.
ओके सर. सो थ्रू द टाइम एंड स्पेस के संदर्भ में हमने वहां पे जो आर्गुमेंट जो दिए गए हैं, उन आर्गुमेंट को एक फैक्चुअल एनालिसिस, ओके, उस फैक्चुअल एनालिसिस उसको किया एंड देन वी कंटेक्चुअलाइज द आर्गुमेंट थ्रू द अदर सोर्सेस.
जी
Okay.
जी
जी sir. And also contextualize it through the other sources, sir.
जी.
Okay.
So
So yeah,
to put it simply, the argument and narrative basically rest on the facts of the case, right? ये facts पे dependent है, and the facts in turn rest on evidence, right? जो आपके तर्क हैं और जो आपका बयान है, जो आपकी कहानी है, वो तथ्यों से निकलती है, तथ्य साक्ष्य से निकलते हैं, and the evidence comes from sources. ऐसा हो रहा है. तो देखिए, आपने एक प्रॉब्लम ली एनालिसिस के लिए, उस प्रॉब्लम के लिए आपने एक उसके साथ आप जूझते हुए आपने एक एक्सप्लेनेशन बनाया. वो एक्सप्लेनेशन आर्गुमेंट और नैरेटिव उसमें दोनों है, दोनों का पक्ष उसमें होगा ही होगा, दोनों होंगे उसमें. ये दो चीजें जो कि आपस में गुथी हुई हैं, ये कुछ फैक्ट्स से निकली हैं, और फैक्ट्स एविडेंस से निकले हैं, और एविडेंस सोर्सेस से निकला है. सो ये जो लिंक है, ये बहुत ही अति आवश्यक है मेरे हिसाब से. ओके. अब इस लिंक को जितना अच्छा आप बनाएंगे अपनी रिसर्च में, अपने पीएचडी थीसिस में, अगर आप किताब लिख रहे हैं तो अपनी किताब में, अगर आप क्लास में लेक्चर दे रहे हैं तो अपने लेक्चर में, अगर आप स्टूडेंट हैं तो अपने आंसर में, अगर ये लिंक ठीक बनेगा तो आपकी हिस्ट्री राइटिंग बहुत अच्छी हो जाएगी. मैं ऐसा मानता हूं. नाउ ऑफ कोर्स one can give very detailed lectures on all of these elements separately. So I can spend maybe an hour on facts. I can spend several hours on evidence. And I can spend a lot of time on sources and what are the different types of sources and what kinds of information do they yield for a particular place or a particular time period. But of course, in this lecture, I don't have that kind of time. So what I will do is to simply show you that when we, very briefly in passing, I'll show you when we look at evidence, what are the sort of questions that historians ask? Okay. Now, basically, you would have seen historians ask some fundamental questions, such as who created this piece of evidence? Evidence कहाँ से आ रहा है? भाई evidence भी किसने बनाया आखिर? Right? What exactly is this evidence? उसकी nature क्या है? How was it created? When was it created? Where was it created? And why was it created? तो इस कॉन्टेक्स्ट में मैं आपको याद दिलाऊं कि जो रडयार्ड किपलिंग थे ना, पोएट एंड स्टोरी राइटर, रडयार्ड किपलिंग, he wrote a very famous poem called I Keep 6 Honest Serving Men. This was written in 1902, and he says in that poem, I keep 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I knew. Their names are what and why and when and how and where and who. Right? I send them over land and sea. I send them east and west. But after they have worked for me, I give them all a rest. I let them rest from 9 till 5, for I am busy then. I also give them breakfast, lunch, and tea, for they are hungry men. But different folks have different views. I know a person small. बच्चे की बात कर रहे हैं. I know a person small. She keeps 10 million serving men who get no rest at all. She sends them abroad on her own affairs from the second she opens her eyes. 1 million house, 2 million wares, and 7 million wives. तो कह रहे हैं कि जो छोटे बच्चे हैं वो बहुत सवाल पूछते हैं. 1 million house, 2 million wares, 7 million wives. बहुत क्यूरोसिटी होती है उनमें. और जब से वो नजर अपनी आंख खोलते हैं सुबह से ही सवाल पूछने लग जाते हैं अपने माता पिता से और लोगों से. लेकिन मैं भी पूछता हूँ, कह रहे हैं मैं तो बड़ा आदमी हूँ, दफ्तर में काम करता हूँ, 9 से 5 तो मैं बिजी रहता हूँ दफ्तर में, लेकिन शाम को फिर मैं बहुत सोचता हूँ, मैं बहुत से सवाल पूछता हूँ. और ये जो 6 सर्विंग, ये जो 6 मेरे नौकर हैं, यानी कि कौन, व्हाट एंड व्हाई एंड व्हेन 3, हाउ वेयर एंड हु 6, ये जो 6 मेरे कर्मचारी हैं, मुझे सब चीजें इन्हीं के जरिए समझ आती हैं. I learn everything through them. So similarly, when we try and examine evidence as historians, as lawyers, as journalists, actually journalists, lawyers, and historians, the work is very similar. Maybe one day I will talk to you about that. Because in the case of all three, the argument or the finding, the claim, right, must rest on the facts of the case. See, this explanation, one sec. This explanation, argument, and narrative, you know, all this yields what I call a claim, right? Argument एक तरह का claim है, हम दावा करते हैं. Claim का मतलब दावा. मेरा दावा है कि भाई 17वीं से 13वीं शताब्दी तक बिहार में रिलीजियस गतिविधियों की वजह से इस तरह का रीजन बना. वो दावा है आपका. ओके, तो ये दावा जो है, it must rest on the facts of the case. Okay, and the facts of the case must rest on evidence. And when you look at evidence, the question is, who created it? What exactly was created? How was it created? When was it created? Where was it created? Why was it created? That means Rudyard Kipling's 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I knew. Okay? लेकिन एक 7वां दास भी है मेरे हिसाब से हिस्ट्री में. वो है कि भाई किसके लिए एविडेंस बनाया आपने? आपने क्या सोचा कि इसको कौन कंज्यूम करेगा? आपने जनरल पब्लिक के लिए बनाया, आपने अपने राजा के लिए बनाया, आपने कुछ चंद मंत्रियों के लिए बनाया, कैबिनेट के लिए बनाया. So for whom may be a 7th slave? So the questions to ask are, did the recorder produce the document for personal use, for one or more individual, or for a large gathering? Is it first-hand evidence or hearsay? Was it meant to be used privately or publicly? Does it offer information or an argument or a perspective? जो आपका एविडेंस है, जो आपका सोर्स है, वो आपको सूचना दे रहा है, तर्क पेश कर रहा है, या कोई दृष्टिकोण पेश कर रहा है, पर्सपेक्टिव पेश कर रहा है, या तीनों पेश कर रहा है. तो इस तरह से सारी चीजें, आपका जो साक्ष्य है वो फर्स्ट हैंड एविडेंस है या सुनी सुनाई बात है. वो जब बना तो जिसने बनाया उसने क्या सोचा कि वो प्राइवेटली यूज होगा या पब्लिक यूज के लिए होगा? वो महाराजा के लिए होगा, कैबिनेट के लिए होगा, या जनता के लिए होगा, वगैरह वगैरह. तो इस तरह से बहुत से सवाल हम पूछ सकते हैं. एंड द हिस्टोरियन इज ट्रेन्ड टू रेज so many questions regarding the many different formations of Kipling's honest serving men, permutations if you like. So for example, I told you initially that when do things happen, where they happen. So where and why do they happen, when they happen. So these are permutations, okay? So in different permutations, you can ask questions about the evidence itself. And when you do that, you cross-check. whether what the evidence reveals is probably correct or not correct. Okay, how authentic is it? How valid is it? Because as you know, if it is valid, then the facts of the case will be strong, and then it may yield a valid argument. Okay, so it is in this way that we look at perspective.